You send a message in a group chat and watch as it gets seen by everyone, but no one responds. And somehow, that silence feels louder than any reply. Because in a space full of people, being ignored doesn't feel neutral. It feels visible. Like everyone saw you and simply chose not to engage, even if that's not what actually happened. And what makes this moment especially uncomfortable is that nothing explicitly negative actually happened. No one rejected you, no one disagreed with you, no one told you that your message didn't matter. And yet the absence of response still feels like a signal, like a piece of information your brain is trying to decode. If you've ever experienced this, just comment "seen." I'm genuinely curious how many people recognize this exact moment, because it happens more often than people admit, and it tends to stay in your head longer than it logically should. And this video is about why small moments like this start to feel like signals about your place in the group, and why your brain treats them as something bigger than they seem. Because what looks like nothing is rarely interpreted as nothing. It becomes something. And that something follows a pattern your brain has learned through repeated social experiences. In everyday group chats, nothing dramatic needs to happen for tension to appear. No one has to say anything negative. No one has to exclude you directly. It can be as simple as delayed replies, skipped messages, or conversations shifting direction without acknowledging what was said before. And these are not explicit actions. They are absences. But in social environments, absences are rarely empty. They exist next to visible activity, and that contrast is exactly what gives them meaning. When other messages receive replies, reactions, or attention, and yours doesn't, the difference becomes noticeable, and your brain starts comparing, even if you're not consciously doing it. Micro example. Imagine a group chat where someone shares a thought or idea, and a few minutes later, the conversation moves on. People respond to each other, react to jokes, build momentum, and continue interacting as if nothing happened. While that one message just sits there, untouched. No one rejects it, no one engages with it, it simply disappears into the flow of conversation. And that disappearance is exactly what creates the signal. Not because something happened, but because something didn't. And the longer it sits there, the more noticeable it becomes. Not necessarily to everyone else, but especially to the person who sent it. Because attention in a group is not just about interaction, it's about visibility in relation to others. About where your message exists compared to everything else that is happening at the same time. Micro summary. In group spaces, what's not acknowledged often feels more meaningful than what is. And that's what pulls us into interpretation. Because the brain doesn't like gaps. It tries to resolve them. And in doing so, it often turns absence into meaning, even when no clear meaning was intended in the first place. And that's where the loop begins. And what makes this even more intense is what happens next. Because the moment your brain notices that gap, it doesn't just leave it unresolved. It starts filling it with possible explanations. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe it wasn't interesting enough. Maybe people just didn't care. And even if none of these explanations are actually true, they still feel real in the moment. Because the brain prefers a flawed explanation over no explanation at all. It tries to close the loop. And once that loop starts forming, you don't just observe the situation, you start relating it back to yourself. Micro example. You might find yourself reopening the chat, checking if someone replied later, rereading your own message, wondering how it sounded, or even mentally rewriting it, thinking about how you could have said it differently. Not because the situation objectively required that level of analysis, but because the lack of response created a space your mind is now trying to resolve. And this is where a simple moment turns into a pattern. Because the next time you're about to send a message, that memory is still there, influencing your behavior in subtle ways. You hesitate a little longer, you edit your message more carefully, or sometimes you decide not to send it at all. And over time, these small adjustments don't just change what you say, they change how present you feel in the group, how visible you allow yourself to be, even if no one explicitly told you to hold back. Modern group chats amplify this because they make attention visible. You can see who saw the message, who replied, how fast they replied, who gets engagement, and who doesn't, creating a transparent layer of interaction that didn't exist before. And once attention becomes visible, it also becomes comparable. And once it's comparable, it starts to feel measurable, almost like a quiet scoreboard that no one agreed to create, but everyone can sense. You don't open the chat thinking about it as a ranking system, but over time, it starts to feel like one. Because you notice patterns: who gets responses quickly, whose messages create conversations, whose messages get ignored, and where your own messages land. And once that scoreboard exists, even loosely, it starts shaping how we behave inside these spaces, often without noticing it. Micro summary. When attention becomes visible and comparable, it starts to feel like social ranking, and that changes how we interpret silence. Culturally, this reflects a broader shift in communication, where responsiveness is not just functional, it's interpreted. Speed of reply, presence in conversations, participation in group spaces act like signals of interest, relevance, and respect, not because anyone agreed on these rules, but because they emerge where interaction is constant. Over time, these signals turn into expectations. Fast replies feel normal, delayed replies feel noticeable, and silence starts to feel meaningful. In earlier social settings, many interactions were private or less trackable. You couldn't always see who responded to whom or how quickly, which meant less comparison. But in digital group spaces, everything is exposed, creating a new layer of meaning where even passive behavior becomes a signal. And silence is rarely neutral because it exists next to others being acknowledged. Micro example. You open a chat and see messages appearing, people replying, reacting, and your message is still untouched. And that contrast is what makes it stand out. This is also why group chats amplify the feeling of replaceability, because when multiple people can respond and attention shifts quickly, it becomes easier for any single contribution to be overlooked, not intentionally, but structurally. The conversation doesn't stop, it just moves, and when it moves without you, it can feel like it didn't need you. Over time, that creates a subtle impression that your presence is optional. And if you've ever noticed yourself hesitating before sending a message, editing it, or deciding not to send it at all, that hesitation is part of the same loop, where past signals start shaping future behavior. You start predicting outcomes before they happen, adjusting how you show up, and those patterns define how comfortable or visible you feel in the group. If you've noticed this in your own experience, where some conversations feel easy while others feel like you're slightly out of sync, that's exactly the dynamic at play. And I'm curious, have you ever felt like your message just disappeared in a group chat without explanation? Drop a comment, because these moments are more common than people admit. As we move toward the bigger picture, the key idea is this. Group chats are not just communication tools. They are environments where attention is distributed, observed, and interpreted, turning even small delays or omissions into signals. Key insight. What feels like personal rejection in group chats is often not about rejection at all. It's about visibility and comparison in a shared attention space. Your brain reads differences in response as differences in value, even when no one is actively making that judgment. And once you see that, the experience shifts. Because the signal was never as direct as it felt, it was constructed through comparison, and understanding that doesn't remove the feeling, but reframes it as part of a system rather than a statement, making it easier to observe without turning it into a conclusion about yourself.